Imagine for a moment that you've just crossed the Atlantic Ocean packed into this tiny ship.
The year is 1607. After nearly 5 months pitching and rolling on the high seas, you finally dropped anchor off a marshy island in eastern Virginia. You have a huge task, along with 100 other men and boys from 2 other ships. Build a profitable colony for England out of the American wilderness.
In time, you will help found the first permanent English settlement in the New World and call it Jamestown after King James I. Your descendants will move Virginia's royal capital a few miles inland, where it will grow into the political crossroads of colonial America. And their descendants, yearning for freedom, will declare war against Mother England. Only a few miles further on, they'll win the final battle of the Revolutionary War.
I'm Bill Boggs, and today we'll visit all 3 of these places so crucial to the establishment of the nation. Jamestown, where the British Crown first established its vast American empire. Williamsburg, where the empire was debated. And Yorktown, where the empire was lost. All within 20 miles of each other, and all places worth visiting for every historic traveler.
Our journey will follow the Colonial Parkway about an hour east of Richmond. We'll begin at Jamestown Island, travel 10 miles north to Colonial Williamsburg, then head east along the wooded parkway to end our trip in Yorktown. England's first outpost in the New World turned out to be a monument to the American dream. Right from the start, the men on the first ships came looking to make fast money and return home to England. Instead, they found a brutal frontier that nearly destroyed them, until they built a new home in America with their own sweat and blood.
This is the original site of the first settlement on Jamestown Island, dating back to the year 1607. It's now preserved as a National Historic Park.
The National Park Service maintains a visitor center here with artifacts on display and a 15-minute introductory film that's a good place to start your exploration. Park Service rangers lead tours of Old Town, where the original fort stood, and the New Town area outside the fort walls, which was settled starting in 1618. All that remains of these early homes and of the colony's first state house are these preserved brick foundations. The Park Service also runs this reconstructed glass house, where historic interpreters practice the art of glass blowing, just as it was done here almost 400 years ago. Within the National Park, the Old Town area is being maintained and excavated by the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities. Bill Kelso is the head of archaeology.
What has been your most recent archaeological find?
Well, the most recent and most exciting, of course, is that we have found evidence that the fort site, James Fort of 1607, still survives, and that most of it is on land and not eroded by the river as people had thought in the past.
Built just after the settlers arrived, the triangular-shaped fort provided protection from Spanish marauders and the local Indians. But relations with the natives were not always hostile. Probably the most famous legend connected to the Jamestown settlement is the story of Captain John Smith and Pocahontas. In books, movies, and most recently a Disney animated feature, Pocahontas has been portrayed as the kind Indian maiden who fed the hungry colonists and fell for Captain Smith. Historians still argue, was it a storybook romance, or was Pocahontas simply an ambassador between the two cultures? In 1614, Pocahontas married colonist John Rolfe in the church that stood on this spot. The original footings of the 1617 church are still visible inside through plate glass. This church is remembered to this day as the home of the first elected lawmaking assembly in the New World. The House of Burgess first met on this spot in 1619. The ruins and artifacts of the National Park are one of the faces that Jamestown shows the world today. The other face is Jamestown Settlement, an historic recreation just down the road from Old Town and run by the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's open 9 to 5 year-round except Christmas and New Year's, with guided tours throughout the day. In addition to the 3 ships that brought the colonists to Virginia, curator Tom Davison showed us their recreation of a Powhatan Indian village of the time.
Tom, in the early days, was the relationship with the Indians always a good one?
Not at all. There were periods of conflict interspersed with periods of peace. During the first 2 years, the periods of peace tended to dominate largely because of the effective role of Captain John Smith as one of the leaders of the colony. By and large, Smith kept more or less a state of peace with the Indians until his unfortunate injury and departure in early 1609. Thereafter, relationships between the English and the Indians went downhill very rapidly, resulting in the very hard winter of 1610, which was called the Starving Time. It was a time of open warfare, during which over 3/4 of all the English inhabitants of Virginia either starved to death or were killed by the Indians.
Yet, the recreation at Jamestown Settlement shows how the colonies survived.
Well, as you can see, the colonists were very well armed, and this is a major factor that contributed to their consistent victory over the Indians in warfare. As time went on, the English in Virginia got better at raising their own food, but they were still dependent upon the production of some sort of goods to ship back to England to make a profit and pay for the colony's costs. Over time, they tried a number of things, from lumber production to wine production. They even hoped to find gold and silver in the colony and send a shipload of ore samples back in England in the hope of striking it rich.
Nothing worked until John Rolfe, Pocahontas's husband, hit on the idea of cultivating tobacco. That was a huge success and has been Virginia's main cash crop ever since. Jamestown managed to flourish after those first very lean years. It remained the capital of Virginia for more than 90 years. But after the State House burned to the ground for the 4th time in 1698, the legislature decided to move the capital 5 miles inland to Williamsburg. Our journey through time winds its way inland now, along the Colonial Parkway to the historic city of Williamsburg, Virginia.
For the traveler with an interest in American history, Colonial Williamsburg is like owning a time machine. This beautiful city has been completely and meticulously restored to its appearance on the eve of the Revolutionary War.
From the buildings and gardens to the furnishings to the costumed interpreters who truly do bring history to life, Williamsburg has become a kind of living monument. It commemorates not only the great patriots of the time like Patrick Henry, Jefferson, and Washington, but also the ordinary men and women who lived and plied their trades here, craftsmen, farmers, and shopkeepers. Up until the 1920s, Williamsburg was an ordinary Virginia tidewater town, historic but a little run down. Then in 1926, the rector of a local church, the Reverend William Goodwin, got billionaire John D. Rockefeller Jr. to restore the town to its colonial glory. Williamsburg began its life as a defensive outpost of Jamestown called Middle Plantation. But this tiny village grew into a gracious city almost overnight when Virginia's capital was moved here in 1869. No motor vehicles are permitted in Colonial Williamsburg, so you'll want to park at the visitor center, buy a ticket, and take the shuttle bus. In and among the lovely Georgian-style homes and shops, you'll find a number of taverns and restaurants, open to the public and serving an authentic period dining experience. Shields Tavern serves hearty meals all day, inspired by colonial cookbooks. Most of its customers of the period were lower gentry and middle class, while select clientele like Colonel George Washington were more often found at the King's Arms Tavern, which was renamed the Eagle after the Revolution. There are a wide variety of modern hotels near the historic area in every price range that can serve as your home base for this entire trip. At the top end in every way is the Williamsburg Inn, featuring gourmet, formal dining and beautiful Regency decor with prices from $200 a night.
For a truly unique lodging experience, you might want to stay at one of the many Williamsburg colonial houses actually in the historic area. This is a brick house tavern. Its period furnishings give it an authentic atmosphere.
Once you've settled in, you can begin to explore the streets of the town. You can glimpse the powdered wig pomp of an 18th century courtroom, or enjoy a performance of the fife and drum corps, or you can peek in on everyday colonists going about their work. There are silversmiths and wheelwrights. Every colonial craft and trade is represented. They imported goods like china, spices, and silk, but much of what the colonists needed was made right here.
And that tradition continues today. These cabinet makers are handcrafting furniture for town buildings just as they would have 200 years ago.
And you can get your hands dirty and join them. The new Williamsburg Institute offers classes in period carpentry and other crafts. For program information, you can call the Institute or the Williamsburg Foundation. Historian Ann Smart Martin says that Williamsburg's craftsmen and merchants were leaders in the growing movement for independence from England, as they objected to the king's taxation without representation.
Fire!
Tensions between the colonists and king continued to mount until an incident that took place here at the Powder magazine made the revolution all but inevitable.
This magazine and storehouse was built by the king to store gunpowder and ammunition to protect the colonists. When tensions began to mount in the 1770s, local militia companies were formed to defend their liberties against the king. Now, when the governor got wind of this, he ordered the British Navy to come in the dark of night to take away the powder.
The colonists were outraged that the governor had stolen their gunpowder, and Patrick Henry led a group of angry volunteers to demand either the gunpowder or payment in cash. They got the payment. By now, British rule in the Virginia colony was on borrowed time. Governor Dunmore holed up here in what the colonists satirically referred to as the governor's palace. Though it bears little resemblance to a true British palace, it certainly is the most elegant building in Williamsburg, with a beautiful formal garden, luxurious gilt, velvet, and mahogany furnishings, and a truly imposing entrance hall.
Well, Ann, this is certainly one of the more macho rooms we visited recently.
Well, the governor's residence certainly was about great wealth and the display of the power of the governor and hence the king. So just imagine coming into this room as a colonist and seeing these arms and flags and the crest of the king. It would have been pretty impressive and awe-inspiring. Of course, none of this symbolic power did any good with the coming of the Revolution. Governor Dunmore fled the palace in November 1775.
Revolution was now a certainty, and this was the place where the revolution in Virginia officially began, the Capitol building.
Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III
Treason!
may profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it.
Patrick Henry's denunciation of the king and the King's Stamp Act inspired Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and other patriots to take up the fight against royal tyranny. After 11 more years of protests, boycotts, and reprisals, the House of Burgesses finally decided they'd had enough. And in May of 1776, they passed the Virginia Resolutions for Independence. These resolutions provided the momentum in the Continental Congress to declare independence from England. And by the 4th of July, the newly formed United States of America was at war with Mother England.
Many heroic and devastating battles in that revolution were fought up and down America's coast, but it all ended just 10 miles from here at Yorktown. Our trip along the Colonial Parkway moves a few miles east now to the final battleground of the Revolutionary War, Yorktown, Virginia. Unlike Jamestown and Colonial Williamsburg, Yorktown is not a recreation, but a 20th century village, although a very small one, with charming colonial-style homes, taverns, and shops. It's also home to several places of interest for the historic traveler. The Yorktown Victory Center maintains a period military encampment, as well as a post-war farm community and an impressive museum offering personal perspectives of those who lived through the Revolution. Chief Historian Ed Ayers guided me through the museum's display of underwater archaeological evidence found in the harbor.
These artifacts are typical of those that were recovered by the underwater archaeologists from some of the British ships that were sunk during the Yorktown campaign. The ones you're seeing here primarily came from the captain's cabin, but others represent some of the weapons they used as well as just parts of the ship. They spent quite a few years diving on one particular ship called the Betsy, which was the best preserved.
With British naval support cut off and the French in control of the Chesapeake Bay, General George Washington saw a golden opportunity and mustered all his forces to prepare for a siege on Yorktown.
Ed, how many men would actually sleep in a tent like this?
Well, 6 men, believe it or not.
6?
Yes. During the siege, several of them might have been firing the cannon out on the siege lines or doing fatigue duty behind the lines, but it was pretty cramped in these quarters.
Take aim! Hark!
What was more commonly in use, rifles or muskets?
Both sides were primarily armed with muskets, not rifles. Muskets could be effective up to only about a range of 40 to 60 yards. Experienced, well-trained soldier could fire a musket 3 to 4 times a minute, but under battlefield conditions, you'd probably be lucky to get off 1 or 2 shots a minute, and pretty soon you would close with bayonets.
Although both sides used the same firearms, the Americans and French still had an edge, artillery, and high ground to put it on. To see how General Washington employed that advantage, we moved next door to the Yorktown Battlefield National Park and Ranger John Short, who took us to a British position known as Redoubt 9.
On October the 6th, the French and American allies opened their first siege line about 900 yards out from the British works. After a few days of firing with their heavy artillery, they could bring the infantry in to assault these works. They would come in at night, charge down these works, cut through the phrases, up over the top, being bayoneted and shotted all the way in. Once these works were taken, then they could concentrate on breaking the rest of the British line. Now, turning around, you can see that once the Allies had their batteries here, they could pound away with their guns at point-blank range at the last British line where the visitor center is now. And Cornwallis now has his back to the water, and there's no escape.
Realizing his situation now hopeless, Cornwallis sent a surrender note to General Washington on October 17, 1781. The surrender terms were negotiated here at the Moore House, still standing more than 200 years later.
Well, we have good eyewitness descriptions. On the left of the highway was the French army drawn up in formation. They looked very good in their white uniforms. Over on the right was the American army in their ragged uniforms, but looking very, very proud. Now down the Hampton Highway comes the British Army in their new red coats, and the band is playing a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," which is really what it must have seemed like to them at the time.
The British deposited their weapons here in Surrender Field, and that was it. The last battle, and for all intents and purposes, the Revolutionary War itself, was over. America had secured its claim to nationhood. This area is one of the few places where you can stay in one hotel and see so much history. Although the Colonial Parkway is only 23 miles long, you'll probably want to allow at least 3 days to cover all the historic ground we've seen. If you have a little more time, you can visit some of the nearby sites, such as Carter's Grove, a restored 18th century plantation featuring reconstructed slave quarters that interpret the colonial experience from the viewpoint of those who worked the land. Or see Richmond, where Virginia's capital was moved during the Revolution and remains to this day. 60,000 military artifacts can be found at Virginia War Museum in nearby Newport News, which gets its name incidentally from Captain Christopher Newport, who brought news of England to the colonists in the days before newspapers.
On the 250th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown, former President John Tyler said, "As the first impress of the Anglo-Saxon was made on this beach, so the first impulse to independence was given at Williamsburg, and the last battle for liberty was fought. at Yorktown. He had in mind something unique about Americans who came to this shore, carved a society out of the wilderness, built it to prosperity, and then divorced themselves from their mother country, all against overwhelming odds. And this journey we've made today through colonial Virginia holds a remarkable power to remind us just how much it took to forge a nation. I'm Bill Boggs. Thanks for joining me on Historic Traveler.